Chapter 1. A Note in the Choir. Loft, St. Winifred's Church, stood serenely under the soft September sky, its ivy-covered stone tower rising above the sleepy village of Little Marlow. The Sunday morning bells rang with familiar charm, summoning parishioners in polished shoes and neatly buttoned coats. Among them was Jessica Fletcher, in the village on a brief stay with her old friend, Reverend Miles Harwood. The church had a kind of poetic stillness, with wooden pews glistening in the early sun and motes of dust dancing through shafts of light. Jessica sat near the front, enjoying the choral prelude. The voices were sweet, if a touch untrained. There was something comforting about an amateur choir, Jessica thought. It wasn't about perfection, but community. As the final hymn faded, a rustling sound drew her gaze upward. From the old choir loft came the clatter of sheet music falling to the floor. Heads turned, including Reverend Harwood's, but no one seemed overly alarmed. Jessica's curiosity was piqued, however. After the service, she made her way through the modest crowd, exchanging greetings and compliments on the sermon. At the back of the nave, a tall, sharp-nosed woman with silver hair spoke in hushed, concerned tones to a young man in a choir robe. Jessica recognized the woman as Beatrice Langdon, the choir mistress, stern, proud, and known to take her duties very seriously. "Oh, it was dreadful," Beatrice was saying. "Everything perfectly in place yesterday, and now this mess." Jessica stepped closer. "Forgive me, Mrs. Langdon, Jessica Fletcher. Visiting from Cabot Cove, I couldn't help noticing a bit of a disturbance in the loft." Beatrice looked her up and down, visibly weighing whether to confide in a stranger. "Yes, someone's been meddling with our music library. Several sheets torn, others rearranged, and this." She handed Jessica a small note. The paper was thin and worn, but the ink fresh. It read, in shaky handwriting, "She doesn't deserve the solo." "I'll see to it." Jessica arched an eyebrow. "Rather ominous. Was there a solo performance this morning?" "Yes," Beatrice replied stiffly. "Molly Trevor's. A beautiful voice, I won't deny it, but rather new. Some feel I've favoured her, but perhaps too soon." Jessica folded the note carefully. "Do you know who might have written it?" Beatrice hesitated. "Well, I've had a bit of tension with our lead tenor, Mr. Colin Drew. He's dramatic and not above jealousy." Just then Molly herself appeared, smiling bashfully as she gathered her handbag from a pew. She was in her early 20s, with a warm complexion and large, hopeful eyes. Jessica watched the way Beatrice smiled too tightly at the girl. Molly glanced nervously toward the loft. "You sang beautifully today," Jessica said kindly. Molly blinked. "Oh, thank you. I was so nervous, actually." "Anything odd happened during rehearsal yesterday?" Molly gave a short nod. "I thought someone had moved my folder, and I could swear I heard footsteps upstairs when I was supposed to be alone. But maybe it was just nerves." Jessica noted the way her fingers fidgeted with her necklace. Something unsaid hovered behind her eyes. Later that afternoon, Jessica and Reverend Harwood shared tea in his cosy vicarage overlooking the village green. A light drizzle painted the window panes. "It's probably nothing," he said, stirring his tea. Little Marlow's choir politics are a soap opera in themselves. Jealousy, pride, nothing new. Jessica chuckled, but her mind remained sharp. True. But that note didn't strike me as harmless, and if someone felt threatened enough to sabotage a performance, what else might they be willing to do? Reverend Harwood raised an eyebrow. "You think this might be something serious?" "I've learnt never to dismiss anonymous threats, especially ones that promise action." That evening, a gathering of choir members met at the parish hall. Jessica attended under the guise of offering encouragement, but her ears remained alert. Colin Drew was there, charming but arrogant, and visibly annoyed when Molly received praise from multiple villagers. When Jessica approached him, he spoke with thinly veiled disdain. "Not everyone appreciates being pushed aside," he muttered, eyes on Molly. "Some of us worked years for our moment." "And yet her voice is remarkable," Jessica replied mildly. "Don't you think she deserved it?" "She's untrained, raw talent, sure. But this isn't a village talent show." He turned abruptly and left before Jessica could press further. She filed his reaction carefully in her mental drawer of suspicious behavior. As the choir rehearsal concluded, the church was locked up for the night. But later, while most of Little Marlow slept beneath its patchwork of chimneys and garden sheds, someone stood inside the empty church. A shadow moved through the nave. The choir loft creaked under the weight of a quiet figure. And in the morning, Molly Trevors would be found unconscious at the foot of the tower steps, her sheet music scattered like feathers around her. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Vestry. Morning had barely broken over Little Marlow when the news spread like ivy through the village lanes. Molly Trevors had been found at the church, injured and unconscious. Jessica, still in her nightgown and housecoat, stood at Reverend Harwood's front window, watching as the constable's motorbike pulled up outside St. Winifred's. "Found her at first light," Harwood explained solemnly, holding his untouched cup of tea. "Old Mr. Bartlett, he opens the church each morning, says he found Molly at the bottom of the bell tower staircase, said it looked like she'd fallen from quite a height." Jessica set her tea down gently. "And her condition?" "Concussed, but alive. They've taken her to Aylesbury Hospital." She nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to take a look, if I may." A short walk later, Jessica and Reverend Harwood arrived at the church. Constable George Moffat, a young man with the air of someone perpetually unsure of his hat size, stood guarding the entrance. He looked up as they approached. "Morning, Reverend. Mrs. Fletcher?" he added with a bashful tip of the cap. "I suppose you've heard?" Jessica gave him a reassuring smile. "We have, Constable. Has anyone examined the tower yet?" He shifted. "I had a quick look before the sergeant arrived. Not much to see, just a lot of scattered sheet music and a broken railing. Looks like a fall. Accident, maybe?" "Maybe," Jessica murmured. "Or maybe not." Inside, the church was cool and hushed, the usual morning light dimmed by the clouds rolling in. Jessica climbed carefully to the choir loft, where music still lay scattered like dry leaves. She picked up a page and examined it. "Did Molly rehearse here last night?" she asked Harwood. He nodded. "Yes, she often practiced after hours, said the church helped her focus." Jessica moved toward the tower stairs, the same narrow, creaky set that now bore a missing rail about halfway up. She knelt by the edge, where a bit of dark thread clung to a nail. She pinched it gently. "Looks like someone's robe got caught," she said softly. "And this nail isn't from the railing, it's from the wall. That's odd." Before she could examine further, Beatrice Langdon entered with her ever-present umbrella and a face like a thundercloud. "This is a disaster," she snapped. "A public scandal right in the heart of our parish." Harwood tried to calm her. "Molly will recover, thank God." Beatrice barely flinched. "I meant for the choir, Reverend. The harvest concert is in 4 days. We've already printed the program." Jessica stepped down from the loft and approached her. "Mrs. Langdon, did you see Molly last night?" "I most certainly did not," she replied briskly. "I left after choir at 7. Molly said she would stay and practice, as she often does, I presumed she locked up. Jessica studied her. And no one else had keys? Beatrice hesitated. Well, Colin Drew has a set. He often helps with moving the music stands. Jessica and Harwood exchanged a glance. They left the church and crossed the village green toward the bakery. Colin Drew was seated at a table outside, sipping coffee and reading the Gazette, though he looked anything but relaxed. Jessica approached gently. Mind if I join you? He lowered the paper. I suppose you've come to ask if I pushed her? Number, I've come to ask how well you knew her. He shrugged. She was talented, ambitious, but not as sweet as everyone thinks. Jessica waited. She fancied herself something special, Colin went on. Said she had a scholarship offer waiting in London. Voice coach, all very glamorous. I told her she should learn humility first. Did you see her last night? Number, the Y went straight home. Jessica turned to go, then paused. You were rather upset after rehearsal yesterday? He looked her in the eye. She didn't deserve the solo, but I'd never hurt her, if that's what you're thinking. Jessica gave him a mild nod and walked on. Back at the vicarage, she sat down to review the facts. Molly, alone in the church, a suspicious fall, a broken railing, and a note from someone who wanted to sabotage her. And yet, Molly herself had seemed wary the day before, as though hiding something. Her thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock at the door. It was Daphne Bartlett, the baker's widow. Mrs. Fletcher, she said quietly. I didn't want to say anything in front of the others, but I saw someone near the church last night, around 8:30. Jessica sat up. Who? Daphne hesitated. I couldn't be sure, but they wore a dark coat, and they were heading round the back toward the vestry door. Jessica smiled gently. Thank you, Mrs. Bartlett. You've been very helpful. Because now she knew what she suspected all along. Molly hadn't fallen by accident. Someone wanted to stop her from singing, and they had almost succeeded. Chapter 3. The Choir, Mistress's Silence. The next morning, a cold drizzle misted Little Marlow's cobbled lanes, and the quiet chatter of villagers centred on one question. What had really happened to Molly Travers? Jessica Fletcher sat in the vicarage study, examining a cup of now cold tea, while Reverend Harwood scanned the newspaper headlines. Molly was still in hospital, unconscious, but stable. No visitors allowed, not yet at least. I can't stop thinking about that broken railing, Jessica said at last, and the torn hem I found near the tower stairs. It wasn't part of the damage, it was deliberate. Harwood nodded slowly. I've had the railing mended this morning. Can't risk another mishap. Jessica stood. I'd like to visit the choir room again. I have a feeling something was left behind. Back at St. Winifred's, the church was deserted. A faint scent of incense lingered in the air, mixed with that musty perfume only stone and age can produce. The choir room, adjacent to the vestry, was lined with old music folders, hymnals, and a blackboard used for scheduling rehearsals. Jessica took her time. She opened each drawer in the choir mistress's desk, careful not to disturb the neat order. On the third attempt, she found something, an envelope marked simply Molly Private. Inside was a short note, unsigned. It read, "You should not have gone looking. What's hidden must remain hidden." Jessica exhaled slowly. That changed things. This wasn't just petty jealousy. Molly had stumbled upon something someone didn't want exposed. A sound behind her made her turn. It was Beatrice Langdon. "I might have known you'd be poking about," she said coolly. Jessica offered a calm smile. "Looking for answers, that's all. I found this." She handed the note over. Beatrice scanned it. Her hands trembled, just slightly. "I've never seen this before." were the last to leave after rehearsal, Jessica said gently. You locked up. Are you absolutely sure no one else returned later? Beatrice looked away. The church door sticks, if not bolted. I suppose someone might have used the vestry entrance. It's rarely checked. Jessica stepped forward. You seem very, distressed, Mrs. Langdon. Was there something else? For a moment, Beatrice looked ready to protest. But then her shoulders slumped, and her usual frostiness melted into something surprisingly fragile. There was an incident. 2 weeks ago. I never reported it. I dismissed it as a prank. Jessica waited patiently. One of the choir folders went missing. Molly's. It turned up 2 days later in the organ loft with an old village map folded inside. Jessica tilted her head. A map? Beatrice nodded. Of the church and surrounding gardens. Annotations in pencil, circles, arrows, markings I didn't understand. Do you still have it? I gave it back to Molly. She said she found it interesting. I told her to stop being silly. I assumed she'd thrown it away. But Jessica knew Molly hadn't. That map, wherever it was now, might be the key to everything. May I ask, do you know of any rumors about the church grounds? Jessica pressed. Secrets? Old stories? Beatrice hesitated. There are whispers, of course. Folklore. The old sexton used to talk about a hidden chamber beneath the chapel floor. Some say it was a priest's hole during the Reformation. Others believe it was a vault used to hide valuables during the Civil War. Jessica raised an eyebrow. And has anyone ever found it? Not to my knowledge. Most think it's nonsense. Jessica smiled faintly. And yet Molly seemed to be searching for something. That evening, Jessica invited Daphne Bartlett for tea. The widow sat in her usual practical cardigan and Wellington boots, looking slightly nervous. You said you saw someone going behind the church, Jessica began gently. Can you remember anything else? A scent? A sound? Daphne thought hard. There was a clang, like metal. I thought it might have been the dustbin, but it was too sharp, and I smelled something sweet, like pipe smoke. My late husband used to smoke it. Jessica's eyes narrowed. That was useful. Pipe tobacco wasn't common anymore, and she knew one person who still used it in the village, Mr. Lionel Craig, the church warden. She stood up at once. Daphne, would you mind terribly if we took a short walk? 10 minutes later they knocked on Lionel Craig's front door. He answered in his slippers and robe, blinking at them with vague irritation. Oh, Mrs. Fletcher? And Daphne? Something the matter? I'd like to ask you about last night, Jessica said pleasantly. Were you near the church? Craig scratched his ear. Might have passed by. I took the dog out after supper. Bit of a wander. Jessica noted the pipe on the side table and the faint scent of vanilla tobacco in the hallway. And did you hear anything unusual? Voices, he said slowly. Near the tower. A man and a girl, I think. Couldn't hear the words. Thought it best not to interfere. Jessica nodded slowly. Mr. Craig, if you remember anything else, even something small, please do tell me. Because now, she was almost certain, Molly had discovered something buried in the church's history. And someone else had discovered that she knew. Chapter 4. Secrets Beneath the Stained Glass. The rain had passed, but a thick fog clung to the gardens surrounding St. Winifred's Church the next morning, muffling sound and lending the churchyard an almost ghostly calm. Jessica Fletcher arrived early, her sensible shoes crunching on damp gravel. She carried a torch in one hand and a folded scarf in the other, just in case the chill worsened. She had spent much of the night reading through a borrowed copy of The History of Little Marlow Parish, a dusty tome from Reverend Harwood's study. In its margins, she had found curious notes scribbled by a previous reader, references to the hidden cross, the hollow step, and one rather cryptic line, "Where music rests, secrets sing." It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jessica moved toward the back of the church, where the rose garden lay quiet. It was a modest plot, just 4 bushes, a weathered bench, and a stone statue of an angel holding a lyre. Something about the statue had always seemed a touch out of place. She walked around it slowly, noting the moss that crept over its base. And there it was, an iron ring partially hidden beneath ivy. She knelt, brushed the greenery aside, and tugged. It didn't budge at first, but with a steady pull and a bit of leverage, the stone shifted. Beneath the statue, cleverly concealed, was a narrow trap door, its hinges rusted with age. Jessica's heart pounded, not with fear, but with anticipation. She opened it slowly. A short flight of stone steps led downward into darkness. She turned on her torch, tucked her scarf tighter, and descended. The passageway beneath the church was narrow and arched, the stone ceiling just above her head. It smelt of earth, candle wax, and time. Along the walls were shallow alcoves, some filled with crumbling crates, others empty. She moved slowly, her torch picking out faint symbols carved into the stone. At the far end, the passage widened into a low-ceilinged room. In the center sat a wooden bench, and beside it, a broken candelabra. On the wall opposite, faded letters had been carved. Fiat Lux. Let there be light. Jessica ran her fingers across the inscription. Someone had been here recently. The dust had been disturbed, and in the corner, folded neatly, lay a piece of choir sheet music. She picked it up carefully. It was Molly's solo, the same piece she had sung before the incident. On the back, scribbled in pencil, were strange notations, numbers, possibly dates, and a crude sketch of the church floor plan with the word beneath circled 3 times. Just then, a noise behind her made her spin around. Footsteps on the stairs. Jessica switched off her torch and stepped into the shadows, heart pounding. A figure emerged, silhouetted by the faint light above. She couldn't see their face, but the person stood still, scanning the chamber. They knelt by the bench, clearly searching for something. Jessica stepped forward quietly. Looking for this? The figure froze, then bolted back up the steps. Jessica followed, but by the time she reached the garden, the figure had vanished into the fog. Later that day, Jessica met with Constable Moffat outside the vicarage. She handed him the sheet music and explained what she'd found. His eyes widened. A hidden chamber? I never knew such a place existed. Few did, Jessica said gently. But someone else found it. Molly certainly did. That's what the warning note meant. She went looking. And I think she found more than history. Constable Moffat scratched his head. But why attack her? Surely no one would do that just to keep old secrets buried. Jessica nodded slowly. Unless the secrets weren't so old, what if she found something down there that pointed to something happening now? Something someone would go to great lengths to hide. She turned toward the fog-shrouded church once more. That evening, Jessica paid a quiet visit to Beatrice Langdon, who was pruning her front hedge with unnecessary fervour. I found the vault, Jessica said without preamble. There was music left behind, Molly's music. She was there. Beatrice's hands stilled. What was she doing down there? Searching for answers, I believe. Perhaps to something she overheard, or found. Beatrice looked away. It's just a story, Mrs. Fletcher, a local legend. Jessica's eyes were kind but firm. No, it's more than that. You knew she was asking questions, didn't you? You just didn't think it would go this far. Beatrice's face crumpled briefly, but she said nothing. Jessica left her with a gentle goodbye and walked into the darkening street. She had enough now to know that someone in the village was lying, not just out of pride or jealousy, but fear. and somewhere in that silence, Jessica suspected, was a motive. Chapter 5. The Belcroft Bargain. The next morning dawned grey and wind-blown. Jessica wrapped her coat tightly as she made her way to Belcroft Cottage, a crooked little house near the old mill road, half hidden behind a collapsing fence and a line of rain-sodden hedges. Inside lived Thomas Belcroft, local historian, reclusive archivist, and, as Reverend Harwood had said with a grimace, a man who knows too much and shares too little. Jessica had telephoned ahead. She was met at the door by Belcroft himself, stooped, wild-eyed, with a beard like an overgrown bramble patch. He wore a cardigan with mismatched buttons and slippers that shuffled across the tiled floor. "You're the American," he said, as if vaguely disappointed. "Come to poke about." "Not poke," Jessica replied with a calm smile. "Just hoping for a little light on some local law." He grunted and led her inside. The cottage was crammed with books, papers, and what looked like decades-old issues of the Little Marlow Gazette. In the corner sat a fireplace with a weak flame, and beside it a tea tray untouched. Jessica spotted a battered wooden box on the side table, filled with yellowing letters. Belcroft noticed her gaze. "Emmeline's," he muttered. "She sang in the choir. Years ago. Died young." He sat down heavily in a threadbare armchair. "Go on then. What do you want?" "I'm interested in the vault beneath St. Winifred's," Jessica began. "Specifically a legend about something hidden there. A chamber marked on a map, perhaps." Belcroft rubbed his chin. "Aye, there's an old tale. The Singer's Secret, they used to call it. But it wasn't just a tale. My grandfather wrote it down from a dying priest who served here during the Great War." He paused, watching Jessica closely. "They said the chamber held a confession, a record, something too dangerous to speak aloud, something that, if read, would shame a family, maybe even bring down the church." Jessica leaned forward. "And you think that confession still exists?" Belcroft looked towards the fire. Not in words, but in symbols. Emmeline found a pattern in the music, hidden notes, rearranged hymns. She was obsessed. Jessica frowned. "A musical code?" "Aye, she claimed it pointed to a name, someone who covered up a crime long ago, but she never finished her work. Died in a boating accident, at least that's what they said." He pulled open the wooden box and handed Jessica one of the letters. "If anything happens to me," it read, "know that it's not the river's doing. Someone is watching. I see him near the tower." Jessica's pulse quickened. This was never just a village tale. Emmeline suspected the same thing as Molly, decades apart. Belcroft nodded slowly. "I kept these letters quiet. What good would it do, digging up old bones? But maybe now. Now it matters." Jessica carefully replaced the letters. "Do you mind if I borrow one?" He waved a tired hand. "Take them all. Maybe it's time the truth had its turn." That afternoon, back at the vicarage, Jessica spread the letters across the table, tracing the lines of Emmeline's last weeks. They were filled with references to song titles, notes on page numbers, and cryptic instructions like "sing backwards the 5th of the 4th." Jessica recognized the structure. It was a cipher, a musical one. She compared the letters to Molly's solo sheet, where notations had also been made. And there it was, the same pattern. Someone had used hymn numbers as codes, each referencing hidden letters. Rearranged, they spelled a single name. "Langdon!" Jessica's breath caught. It wasn't Beatrice's name, at least not directly. But Beatrice's father had been choirmaster during Emmeline's time. Just then the telephone rang. Jessica answered. It was Constable Moffat. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, voice strained. "We've had another incident." Beatrice Langdon's house was broken into. Jessica's grip tightened on the receiver. "Is she all right?" She wasn't home, but her study was ransacked. Someone was looking for something specific. Jessica glanced back at the letters. Whoever had silenced Emmeline, whoever had tried to stop Molly, they were still watching, and they were getting desperate. Chapter 6. The Quiet Confession. The wind had grown restless by nightfall. As Jessica Fletcher walked through the village toward Beatrice Langdon's house, it whispered through hedgerows and rattled old signs. Lights flickered in windows as curtains were drawn. Little Marlow, despite its charm, now felt cloaked in unease. When she reached the Langdon residence, a tall, narrow house at the end of Elderbury Lane, Jessica found the front door already ajar. She knocked gently before stepping inside. "Beatrice?" she called out softly. "In here," came a frail voice from the drawing room. Jessica found Beatrice seated by the fireplace, a wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea, though she didn't seem aware she was spilling it. Jessica took the pot gently from her. "You're in shock." Beatrice looked up, eyes red. I went out for supper. I needed time to think. When I came back, everything was gone through my desk, the drawers. They left the silver, the cabinet, but took papers, music, sheets. Jessica sat beside her. "You know what they were looking for, don't you?" Beatrice nodded slowly. Then, from the small side table, she picked up a torn letter and handed it to Jessica. Jessica read silently. The paper was aged, torn from the middle, and only half legible. Must never come to light. He did not act alone. I fear for what will become of Emmeline if she continues. Tell her. That was all. Jessica folded the letter gently. "Where did you find this?" "It was with my father's things," Beatrice whispered. "After he died, I kept it buried at the bottom of a drawer. I didn't know what to do." Jessica's voice was calm. "You recognized Emmeline's name?" "Yes. She was one of Father's favorites. Bright, talented, but persistent. She asked questions, wanted access to the church's archives. He denied her. I thought it was about ambition. I didn't understand." Jessica reached for her hand. "And now, Molly?" Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. "I see it so clearly. Molly reminded me of her, that same spark, the same questions." Jessica nodded. "You said your father kept her away from the archives. Do you think he hid something?" Beatrice hesitated, then walked slowly to a corner cabinet and opened it. Inside was a small metal key, old and worn. "This unlocks the lower archive drawer beneath the vestry," she said. "It hasn't been used in years. I never had reason to, until now." Jessica took the key with quiet reverence. "I'll be careful." As she stood to leave, Beatrice spoke again, her voice little more than a whisper. "You must understand, Mrs. Fletcher, my father was not a bad man, but he was afraid of what the truth might do, to his name, to the parish." Jessica turned at the door. "The truth has a way of finding light, Mrs. Langdon. It waits patiently in shadows, but it always surfaces. That night, the church was silent as Jessica and Constable Moffat entered. The vestry smelled of candle wax and damp stone. She found the old chest of drawers in the far corner and inserted the key. With a click, it opened. Inside were several dust-covered files, marked with faded names and numbers. Jessica sifted carefully, then paused. One file had been sealed with wax, now brittle and easy to break. She opened it and gasped softly. Inside were documents, a formal church record, a letter from a bishop, and a signed statement written by a man named Henry Langdon, Beatrice's father. The statement confessed that during his tenure as choirmaster, he had discovered that the church's treasurer, Edmund Croft, had been embezzling funds from the parish trust. When Emmeline stumbled upon financial records proving the theft, she confronted Langdon, trusting him to act. But fearing the scandal, he destroyed the evidence. Shortly after, Emmeline drowned in what was ruled an accident. But the letter suggested more. She said she would go to the bishop. I couldn't stop her, but Edmund did. I fear it was no accident. My silence makes me complicit. Jessica closed the folder slowly. The truth was out, and it was damning. They left the vestry in silence, the only sound the distant toll of the church bell. Later, in her guest room at the vicarage, Jessica sat by the window, thinking. If Edmund Croft had silenced Emmeline, and someone now was trying to silence Molly, could it be that Croft or someone connected to him was still alive? Still protecting the secret? Just then, a light flickered across the green. A figure moved in the mist near the church. Jessica leaned forward. The past was no longer buried, and tomorrow she would confront the one person she now suspected above all others. Chapter 7. The Orchard's Reckoning. Morning broke cold and clear, and the village of Little Marlow awoke to the low hum of anticipation. Word had spread. Jessica Fletcher had uncovered something in the church archives, and the parish council had called a special gathering in the parish hall. Inside, chairs scraped across the wooden floor as villagers shuffled in, murmuring and exchanging theories. Some faces were tight with concern, others with curiosity. At the front sat Reverend Harwood, looking grave. Jessica stood quietly at his side, clutching a small leather folder. The doors opened once more, and in walked Graham Croft, estate manager, church patron, and grandson of the late Edmund Croft. Tall, composed, and always immaculately dressed, Graham had long been a quiet presence in village affairs. Few knew much about him beyond his careful smile and generous donations to the church. Jessica's gaze followed him closely. She stepped forward, gently tapping the folder in her hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority of experience, "thank you for coming on such short notice. What I'm about to share may come as a shock to some of you." She opened the folder and held up the aged statement signed by Henry Langdon. This is a confession written by the late choirmaster. It reveals that Edmund Croft, once the parish treasurer, embezzled funds meant for the church and the community. When a young choir member, Emmeline Harrow, discovered the fraud, she attempted to report it. Days later, she drowned. A gasp rose from the audience. Jessica continued. Her death was ruled an accident, but this document suggests otherwise. Henry Langdon believed that Edmund had silenced her to protect himself. From the back of the room, Graham Croft stood. "This is outrageous," he said sharply. "These are accusations against a man who's been dead 40 years. Jessica nodded. "Yes, they are, but they explain why a second young woman, Molly Trevors, was attacked in the very same church after uncovering similar records your grandfather never destroyed." He sneered. "You're implying I had something to do with it?" Jessica stepped closer, her eyes steady. "I'm suggesting you had a reason to keep the truth buried. You were seen near the church the night Molly fell, and Beatrice Langdon's house was broken into shortly after you argued with her at choir rehearsal." A hush fell over the room. Graham's face flushed. "This is slander." "Is it?" Jessica said calmly. "Molly found Emmeline's old cipher and connected it to recent donation discrepancies. She confronted someone who tried to frighten her off. When that didn't work, they followed her to the church." From the audience, Daphne Bartlett stood. "I saw you that night, Mr. Croft, near the vestry. I recognized your walk." Graham turned pale. When Emmeline approached him with questions, he tried to dismiss her gently. But when Molly came dangerously close to connecting the dots publicly, he panicked, hence his confrontation with her that led to her fall, he admitted finally, his voice hard. She was making wild accusations, digging into old records she barely understood. She said she'd go public, ruin my family's name. You followed her into the church, Jessica pressed. You didn't mean to harm her, just scare her. But she fell. He swallowed and for a moment looked utterly small. She tripped. I swear I didn't push her. Constable Moffat stepped forward, placing a hand on Graham's shoulder. I think it's time we spoke properly, sir. Graham didn't resist as he was led away. The hall fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the distant toll of the noon bell. Later that afternoon, Jessica sat with Reverend Harwood under the orchard trees behind the vicarage. The sun had returned, casting golden light through the shifting leaves. Harwood sipped his tea. You've done this village a great service. Jessica chuckled. Sometimes solving a mystery just means listening to the echoes. They're always there if you're quiet enough. He tilted his head. Will you be staying long? Jessica looked up at the bell tower, still and silent in the sunlight. No, she said. I think it's time I went home. Chapter 8. The Last Toll. The morning of Jessica Fletcher's departure was painted with crisp autumn light and the quiet stirrings of a village returning to itself. The scandal had broken like a storm, yet now the skies were clear again, though the shadows it left would not easily be forgotten. Outside St. Winifred's, a gentle breeze stirred the orchard's amber leaves as Jessica stood beside Molly Trevors. The young singer leaned on a walking stick, her head still bandaged, but her spirit evidently recovering. You should have seen Beatrice, Molly said, smiling. She brought me tea and lemon biscuits, and even asked if I'd consider returning to the choir. Jessica chuckled. That's her way of saying thank you. I still don't understand how it all connected, Molly admitted, looking toward the church. It started with music and ended in confession and ruin. Jessica nodded thoughtfully. The notes were only part of it. Emmeline left clues in the one place she knew her voice would live on, in music. But the truth she uncovered was buried by fear, until you, Molly, refused to let it stay silent. Molly's eyes gleamed. And Graham? He's been charged with obstruction and reckless endangerment, Jessica replied. It wasn't murder, but he admitted he confronted you that night and that his panic caused your fall. The past caught up with him, just as it eventually catches us all. The church bell rang once, deep and solemn. Jessica turned toward it, her gaze lingering on the tower. That evening, as the village quietened once more beneath a golden dusk, Jessica boarded the small local train. Her suitcase was tucked neatly beneath her seat, and on her lap rested a slim folder containing the letters of Emmeline Harrow. Through the window, the village of Little Marlow faded from view, its patchwork of rooftops, ivy-covered stone, and the bell tower that had borne witness to so many secrets. Across from her sat Daphne Bartlett, clutching a basket of fresh scones and a newspaper. I don't know how you do it, Jessica, she said, shaking her head. You find things no one even thinks to look for. Jessica smiled gently. People think murder is about violence, but more often it's about silence, things left unsaid, secrets buried too deep. Daphne patted her hand. Well, I hope you'll return. You've left quite the impression. Jessica looked out the window one last time as the train chugged toward Cabot Cove. In the distance, the bell tower stood silhouetted against the twilight, silent once more, but now it stood with truth, because the final verse had been sung, and justice had found its echo